Beneath the glittering surface of Hollywood's golden age lies a history of forbidden stories, hidden identities, and loves that dared not speak their name. And in 1933, one film managed to slip past the gatekeepers of morality to deliver something truly revolutionary. While most moviegoers saw a lavish historical drama, those who knew where to look witnessed something far more subversive, a celebration of gender fluidity and same-sex desire that somehow made it to theaters across America. When Greta Garbo stepped onto the set of Queen Christina, she wasn't just playing a historical figure, she was channeling her own truth through the story of Sweden's most controversial monarch. The film portrayed a ruler who defied every expectation of womanhood, and behind the camera, a star who lived by her own rules in an industry desperate to control her. This is the untold story of how one of Hollywood's most enigmatic stars used her power to create a queer masterpiece right under the noses of studio executives. The year was 1933, and Hollywood stood at the precipice of a moral panic. Within months, the infamous Hays Code would clamp down on anything deemed indecent or immoral, including any hint of homosexuality. But in this narrow window of creative freedom, Garbo seized an opportunity to tell a story that mirrored her own reality. What followed was a cinematic rebellion so subtle, yet so profound, that even today, it feels startlingly modern. Let's peel back the layers of Hollywood glamour to reveal the truth behind Queen Christina, a film that refused to hide the lesbian romance at its core, despite the censors' best efforts. Queen Christina of Sweden wasn't just any monarch. Crowned at age 6 following her father's death, she was deliberately raised as if she were a prince rather than a princess. The real Christina dressed in men's clothing, rode astride rather than side saddle, and developed what contemporaries described as distinctly masculine mannerisms. She refused marriage proposals from royal suitors across Europe, declared she would die a bachelor, and maintained a suspiciously close relationship with her lady-in-waiting, Countess Aspare. Historical records show Christina frequently referred to herself using male terms. She signed documents as the king rather than the queen, and openly challenged gender norms of the 17th century Europe. When she eventually abdicated her throne in 1654, many historians believe it was partly to escape the constant pressure to marry and produce an heir, a fate that would have confined her to a traditional female role she had always rejected. These facts weren't just background details for the film, they were its foundation. While most historical dramas of the era sanitized their subjects to fit conventional morality, Queen Christina did something remarkable. It embraced its protagonist's gender-bending nature and hinted strongly at her romantic relationships with women, even as it manufactured a heterosexual love story to satisfy studio demands. When MGM began developing the project, they knew exactly who should play this complex character. Only one actress in Hollywood had both the star power to carry such an ambitious film and the personal connection to the material that would bring authenticity to the role. By 1933, Greta Garbo was already a legend. Her haunting beauty and mysterious persona had captivated audiences worldwide, but few knew the private reality behind the silver screen image. Like Christina, Garbo defied easy categorization. She too avoided marriage, preferred wearing pants to dresses, and maintained deeply intimate relationships with women throughout her life. Most significant among these relationships was her connection to Mercedes de Acosta, a lesbian playwright and screenwriter known for her relationships with many of Hollywood's leading ladies. Their intense affair began in 1931, just 2 years before Queen Christina went into production. Through de Acosta, Garbo was introduced to a circle of queer artists and intellectuals who helped her embrace her own sexuality at a time when such feelings were rarely acknowledged, let alone accepted. Another key figure in Garbo's life was Salka Viertel, who co-wrote the screenplay for Queen Christina. Viertel, rumored to have been romantically involved with Garbo herself, created a safe environment where the star could express her authentic self. Together with Viertel, Garbo shaped the character of Christina to reflect aspects of her own identity, crafting dialogue and scenes that spoke directly to queer audiences while flying just under the radar of studio oversight. What made Queen Christina truly revolutionary was Garbo's unprecedented level of creative control. At the height of her fame, she wielded enough power to influence casting decisions, script revisions, and even the choice of director. She famously insisted on casting her former lover John Gilbert as her leading man, despite his career being in decline after the transition to sound films. This wasn't mere sentiment, it was strategic. Gilbert understood Garbo in ways few others did, creating a comfortable dynamic that allowed her more freedom to explore the queer aspects of her character. The genius of Queen Christina lies in how it communicated its true message. Unable to explicitly portray lesbian relationships, the filmmakers employed a technique now recognized as queer coding, using visual cues, double entendre, and symbolic imagery to signal queerness to those who would recognize it. The film opens with young Christina being raised as a prince, dressed in boys' clothing, and taught to hunt, ride, and rule rather than sew or dance. As an adult, she continues to dress androgynously, often appearing in men's attire, complete with boots and wide-brimmed hats. But it's not just her appearance that signals her rejection of traditional gender roles. It's written into the very dialogue of the film. In one pivotal scene, Christina's chancellor urges her to marry, saying, "But your majesty, you cannot die an old maid," to which Christina famously replies, "I have no intention to, Chancellor. I shall die a bachelor." This line wasn't just a clever quip. It was a direct acknowledgement of Christina's self-conception as existing outside the boundaries of conventional womanhood. Perhaps most daringly, the film includes a scene where Christina shares an intimate kiss with her lady-in-waiting, Countess Ebba. Though framed as platonic in the context of the film, the lingering nature of their embrace and the meaningful glances exchanged beforehand clearly suggest deeper feelings. Studio censors were reportedly concerned this moment could be construed as lesbianism, which was, of course, exactly the point. The film's most famous sequence occurs when Christina, disguised as a man, meets the Spanish envoy Antonio at a snowy inn. He initially believes her to be a young nobleman, and their early interactions are charged with homosocial tension. When he later discovers her true gender, their relationship continues with barely a pause, suggesting that their attraction transcends conventional categories of sexual orientation. After they become lovers, Christina wanders around their shared room, caressing objects and declaring she wants to memorize everything about this space where she found happiness. This scene, lasting several minutes with minimal dialogue, has been analyzed by film scholars as one of cinema's most sensual, non-explicit moments, a celebration of desire that manages to be both restrained and deeply erotic. The sequence at the country inn represents the film's most subversive exploration of gender and sexuality. When Christina, dressed as a man, arrives seeking lodging, she's informed there are no private rooms available. The innkeeper suggests she share accommodations with another gentleman traveler, who happens to be Antonio, the Spanish envoy she will eventually fall in love with. Their initial encounter is loaded with homoerotic subtext. Antonio clearly finds this young man intriguing, and their conversation over dinner carries flirtatious undertones that would have been unmistakable to queer viewers of the era. When Christina finally reveals her true gender to Antonio, his surprise is momentary, but his attraction remains unchanged, suggesting that his desire transcends gender altogether. This scene is particularly revolutionary because it forces the audience to confront the fluidity of attraction. For several minutes of screen time, viewers watch what appears to be romantic tension developing between two men, one of whom is played by a woman the audience recognizes as Greta Garbo. This creates a fascinating layer of gender performance that was unprecedented in mainstream cinema. The audience knows Christina is a woman, but within the world of the film, Antonio perceives her as male, yet is drawn to her regardless. When he later discovers she is female, the transition is seamless, implying that gender is merely a superficial aspect of attraction. The dialogue in this scene is carefully crafted to emphasize Christina's comfort with gender ambiguity. When Antonio comments that a handsome young man like yourself cannot sleep alone, Christina responds with easy confidence rather than embarrassment or offense. Throughout their interaction, she maintains the masculine persona she has adopted, showing no discomfort with being perceived as male. This casual attitude toward gender performance would have resonated powerfully with queer viewers of the era, many of whom navigated similar scenarios in their own lives. What follows is a love scene revolutionary for its time. Rather than exploiting Garbo's beauty through the male gaze, as was common in films of the era, director Ruben Mamoulian focuses on the character's agency and desire. Christina actively pursues Antonio, initiating their physical relationship, rather than passively receiving his advances. The famous room memorization sequence that follows their lovemaking centers entirely on Christina's experience of pleasure and fulfillment, shot in extended close-ups of Garbo's face expressing complex emotions. During this remarkable scene, Christina moves slowly through the room, caressing objects, the bed, a candlestick, grapes from their meal, as she declares, "I have been memorizing this room. In the future, in my memory, I shall live a great deal in this room." The sensuality of this moment is unmistakable, yet it completely circumvents the censor's typical concerns about physical displays of passion. Instead, Mamoulian creates an intensely erotic experience through suggestion and emotion, focusing on the afterglow of intimate connection rather than the act itself. This approach to filming intimacy was radical in 1933. By focusing on Christina's subjective experience rather than presenting her as an object of desire, Mamoulian created a scene that resonated deeply with female viewers, particularly those who recognized their own same-sex desires in Garbo's performance. For Garbo, Queen Christina was far more than another role. The parallels between her life and the Swedish queens were striking, and she approached the part with unusual personal investment. Both were Swedish women who challenged convention, both felt constrained by public expectations, and both sought freedom to love according to their own nature rather than society's demands. Garbo's relationship with Mercedes de Acosta was at its most intense during the film's production, with de Acosta often visiting the set. Their correspondence from this period reveals how deeply Garbo identified with Christina's struggles. In one letter, she wrote about feeling trapped between her public persona and private desires, a sentiment directly reflected in the film's portrayal of a monarch torn between duty to her country and loyalty to her authentic self. The connection between Garbo and de Acosta was one of Hollywood's most passionate yet tumultuous relationships. De Acosta, known as the lesbian Lothario of Hollywood, had romanced many famous women, but her relationship with Garbo stood apart. Over their 30-year connection, Garbo would write 181 letters, cards, and telegrams to de Acosta, correspondence that would later become the subject of intense speculation when de Acosta, facing financial hardship near the end of her life, sold her papers to a museum. Though the letters were sealed until 10 years after both women had died, their relationship had profound influence on Garbo's artistic key choices during the Queen Christina period. The star's insistence on casting John Gilbert as her love interest also carried personal significance. Their off-screen romance had ended years earlier, but Garbo maintained genuine affection for him. By selecting a former lover with whom she shared real history, Garbo created space for authentic emotional connection within the framework of a heterosexual love story that was essentially a studio requirement. This allowed her to fulfill contractual obligations while still infusing the film with emotional truth drawn from her own experiences. Interestingly, the role of Antonio was originally intended for Laurence Olivier, who had filmed a love scene with Garbo but failed to create the chemistry she needed. Olivier later wrote in his autobiography that when he took Garbo in his arms to awaken her passion, he was met with only shyness and cold eyes. The British actor was quickly replaced by Gilbert, despite studio head Louis B. Mayer's notorious dislike of the actor. Garbo simply stated, "I want Gilbert," and her star power made it impossible for MGM to refuse, a remarkable demonstration of female agency in 1933 Hollywood. What makes Queen Christina extraordinary is how it manages to tell two stories simultaneously: the heterosexual romance demanded by the studio and the queer narrative embedded within every frame through performance choices, visual composition, and subtext. Viewers attuned to the film's coded language could easily recognize that Christina's true emotional life existed beyond her relationship with Antonio. To understand the true daring of Queen Christina, we must consider its timing. Released in December 1933, it emerged during Hollywood's pre-code era, a brief window between the introduction of the Motion Picture Production Code in 1930 and its strict enforcement beginning in July 1934. During these few years, films explored controversial themes with surprising frankness, addressing sexuality, violence, and social issues in ways that would soon become impossible. The Hays Code explicitly prohibited the depiction of sex perversion, which included any suggestion of homosexuality. Had Queen Christina been produced even a year later, many of its most significant moments would have been cut or altered beyond recognition. The film thus stands as a final statement of artistic freedom before decades of censorship descended on Hollywood. What's remarkable is how the production team anticipated the coming restrictions. Rather than presenting Christina's queerness explicitly, they encoded it in ways that would survive even after the code was enforced. The film's lasting impact stems partly from this strategic approach, creating a text that could be read differently by different audiences, with its true meaning accessible to those who shared its perspective, while remaining plausibly deniable to censors. The film's ending departs significantly from historical fact. Rather than showing Christina's abdication as a step toward religious conversion, she later became Catholic. The film presents it as a sacrifice for love. When Antonio dies in a duel, Christina proceeds with her plan to leave Sweden alone, standing at the bow of a ship sailing toward an uncertain future. This famous final shot, an extended close-up of Garbo's face as the wind blows through her hair, has become one of cinema's most iconic images. Director Mamoulian instructed Garbo to make her face a blank sheet of paper onto which viewers could project their own emotions. The result is a moment of extraordinary ambiguity, simultaneously conveying grief, liberation, and anticipation. For queer audiences, this ending carried special resonance. Christina chooses freedom over conformity, leaving behind the constraints of her royal role to face life on her own terms. Though she has lost Antonio, her journey continues independently, not as a tragic conclusion, but as a beginning. In an era when films typically required women to end up either happily married or tragically dead, Christina charts a third path of self-determination and independence. The symbolism wasn't lost on viewers who themselves face difficult choices between authentic self-expression and social acceptance. Christina's solitary figure facing the horizon became an emblem of queer resilience, the individual who chooses personal truth over conventional happiness. Upon its release, Queen Christina received mixed reviews from critics who often focused on its historical inaccuracies rather than its artistic merits. Box office returns were solid but not spectacular, and for decades the film was remembered primarily as a showcase for Garbo's talent rather than for its progressive themes. It wasn't until the rise of feminist and queer film studies in the 1970s and 80s that scholars began to recognize the film's revolutionary approach to gender and sexuality. Modern analysis has positioned Queen Christina as a foundational text in queer cinema, one that managed to present a lesbian historical figure with remarkable authenticity despite the constraints of its era. The film's most striking achievement may be its visualization of queer female desire in an era that barely acknowledged women's sexuality at all. While lesbian characters had occasionally appeared in literature and stage plays, they were virtually non-existent in Hollywood cinema. When they did appear, they were typically portrayed as predatory or pathological, cautionary figures rather than sympathetic protagonists. Queen Christina broke this pattern by presenting its gender-nonconforming heroine as noble, intelligent, and deeply human. Her desires, whether for women or for freedom from gender constraints, are portrayed as natural expressions of her authentic self rather than as perversions to be corrected. This humane portrayal becomes even more remarkable when we consider how swiftly Hollywood would move to erase such representations. Once the Hays Code was strictly enforced beginning in mid-1934, even the subtle coding used in Queen Christina became impossible. LGBTQ characters virtually disappeared from American cinema for decades, or appeared only as coded villains and comic relief. The film thus stands as a rare window into what might have been possible had artistic freedom prevailed over moral censorship. Garbo herself would go on to play another gender-bending role in Sylvia Scarlett, 1935, appearing in male drag for significant portions of the film. But never again would she have the creative freedom she enjoyed with Queen Christina, a project that allowed her to express aspects of her identity that would otherwise remain private. After retiring from film at the age of 35, Garbo maintained her famous reclusiveness, never marrying and guarding her personal life fiercely until her death in 1990. The film's legacy extends beyond academia. It has become a touchstone for LGBTQ audiences who continue to find representation in Christina's refusal to conform to gender norms and in Garbo's nuanced performance. The character's famous declaration that she'll die a bachelor has been embraced as an early assertion of gender-nonconforming identity on screen. Perhaps most significantly, Queen Christina demonstrates how art can communicate truth even under conditions of censorship. Through careful coding, strategic casting, and the sheer force of Garbo's presence, the film created a space for queer expression in an environment actively hostile to such voices. When we watch Queen Christina today, we see not just a historical drama, but a document of resistance, a film that dared to tell truths its era wasn't ready to hear. Behind its lavish costumes and romantic plot lies a radical assertion of female autonomy and sexual freedom that feels startlingly contemporary nearly a century later. The film endures because its central message transcends its historical moment. Christina's struggle to reconcile personal authenticity with public expectations remains deeply relevant in a world still negotiating the boundaries of gender and sexuality. Her famous line, "I was born queen, but I live as I choose," continues to resonate with anyone who has had to fight for the right to self-definition. Queen Christina reminds us that queer history isn't a recent development, but a constant presence, sometimes hidden, but never completely erased. Through the collaboration of Garbo, Virtel, and their colleagues, a 17th century Swedish monarch became a powerful symbol for 20th century audiences searching for reflections of their own experiences on screen. The film stands as testament to the power of art to preserve truth even in hostile circumstances. Despite the censors' efforts, the lesbian romance at the heart of Queen Christina couldn't be hidden, and nearly a century later, it continues to shine as one of cinema's most powerful early representations of queer identity and desire. As we continue to uncover and celebrate these hidden histories, Queen Christina remains a brilliant example of how the most revolutionary acts sometimes occur in plain sight, if only we know where to look.